The morning sun glinted off the water like scattered diamonds, and Marcus Chen couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly at peace. 4 years of fighting through divorce proceedings, 2 years rebuilding his life after the settlement, and 6 months of finally paying off the house entirely. This pool, this backyard, this entire 3-acre property in the hills overlooking the valley was entirely his. No mortgage, no lawyers, no compromise. He stood at the glass sliding door with his coffee, watching the water shimmer. The night before, he'd added new cedar planters along the fence line. This morning, he'd gotten a text from his business partner. The Shanghai deal had closed. 57% increase in revenue projected by year-end. At 42 years old, Marcus felt like he was finally living the life he'd earned. He pulled open the sliding door, barefoot on the cool pavers, breathing in the morning air. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet maybe. The Hendersons' house to the east was blocked by the mature oak trees. To the west, the Kowalskis' property was separated by 8 feet of dense hedging and privacy fence. Behind him, nothing but the open valley stretching down to the freeway corridor 2 miles away. Marcus sat in the wicker lounge chair and settled back, closing his eyes. Just 15 minutes. That's all he wanted before the day really started, before email, calls, decisions, problems. He was drifting into that perfect space between wakefulness and sleep when he heard it. A splash. Not his splash, he hadn't moved. Marcus's eyes snapped open. The water rippled in lazy circles from the deep end. He stared, waiting. Maybe a bird, a large bird maybe, or the deer that sometimes came through at dusk, though not usually at 8 in the morning. Then he saw her. The woman surfaced near the middle of the pool, treading water, her blonde hair plastered to her scalp. She was wearing a bright pink bikini, and she moved with the ease of someone completely comfortable in that water. She turned, spotted Marcus, and instead of shock, her face broke into a massive smile. "Oh my God, the pool is amazing," she shouted, doing a lazy backstroke. "You must have just had it serviced. The chemical balance is perfect." Marcus stood up slowly, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. "I'm sorry, who are you?" His voice came out steadier than he felt. The woman stood up in the shallow end, water cascading off her shoulders. She was in her late 30s, fit in that expensive maintenance way that spoke of trainers and nutritionists. Her face was arranged in an expression of such complete confidence that it took Marcus a moment to realize she genuinely didn't understand why he was confused. "I'm Corinne Whitney. I live 3 houses down, the Blue Mediterranean Villa," she gestured vaguely toward the eastern boundary. "I was taking my morning walk. I do exactly 6.2 miles every day, and I noticed your gate latch is broken, so I kind of let myself in. I was hoping you wouldn't mind if I used the pool. My contractor is doing construction on mine, and it's just so disruptive, and I saw you had this beautiful." "You broke into my house," Marcus said, not a question, a statement of fact. Corinne's smile faltered slightly, but then she laughed. "Broken is such a harsh word. I mean, your fence is coming apart at the hinges. It's basically an open invitation. And anyway, it's not like you're even using it right now. I just wanted to get my morning swim in before my Pilates class." Marcus walked to the edge of the pool. Every single cell in his body was screaming at him to grab her and physically remove her from his property. But he was trying, desperately trying, to be the kind of man who handled things with dignity. "You need to get out of my pool," he said quietly. "Oh, come on." Corinne swam toward the steps, clearly unbothered. "In my old neighborhood, everyone shared communal pools. It's so much more friendly. We could establish an arrangement. Maybe you use mine when your fence is fixed. I use yours during construction. We could alternate Tuesdays and—" "Get out of my pool." The shift in his tone made her pause. She climbed out slowly, water dripping from her skin, and Marcus noticed she didn't look embarrassed. If anything, she looked annoyed at being inconvenienced. She grabbed a towel from— where had she gotten a towel? That was from his pool house. She'd been in his pool house. "You know, you're being really rude about this," Corinne said, wrapping the towel around her waist with theatrical precision. "I was just trying to be neighborly. My therapist says I'm too open with people, and this is exactly the kind of rejection that—" "This is not rejection. This is private property. You're trespassing." "I'm trespassing?" She laughed, a sharp, bright sound that didn't contain any humor. "Marcus, I think you need to take a step back. I'm a neighbor trying to use a shared community resource, and you're acting like I'm some kind of criminal. I'm calling my lawyer." "Do it." She stared at him for a moment, her jaw tightening. He could almost see the gears turning in her head, the recalibration happening as she realized he wasn't going to bend. wasn't going to be shamed into being reasonable, wasn't going to respond to social pressure. You know what? She turned and started walking toward the gate. I came here peacefully and you treated me like I'm nothing. I won't forget this, Marcus. I actually won't. He watched her go, watched her march through the side gate with such fury that she nearly tore it off its hinges, the very hinges she'd apparently already compromised. He stood by the pool, steam still rising from the water, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. He should have known, right then, that this wasn't over. That Karen Whitney wasn't the kind of person who let small humiliations slide. But Marcus had spent the last 2 years learning to trust his peace. He'd spent money on therapy, on meditation apps, on the deliberate practice of letting go of anger. He genuinely believed he'd evolved beyond the point where other people's dysfunction could affect him. He was wrong about that. Marcus went inside, showered, and dressed for work. He tried to check his email, but his mind kept drifting to Karen Whitney, to the absolute certainty in her expression as she'd said she wouldn't forget this. By 9:30, he'd managed to convince himself that it had been a one-off incident, the kind of weird neighborhood encounter that would blow over within a week. By 10 o'clock, his lawyer called. "Your neighbor just filed a complaint with the city," Margaret said without preamble. Margaret had been his divorce attorney, and she'd seen the worst of people. She didn't waste time on politeness. "She's claiming you denied her access to shared community water facilities." Marcus closed his eyes. "There are no shared facilities, Margaret. It's a private pool on my private property." "I know that, but she's claiming the entire cul-de-sac was developed as a mixed-use community property setup. That's not true, right?" "Absolutely not. I have clear title. The deed specifies." "She's also filed a report saying you verbally accosted her when she was trying to use what she believed to be a public amenity. She says you were hostile and threatening." "She broke into my house, Margaret." "She says the gate was broken, and she was trying to be helpful." There was a long silence between them. "Is she serious?" Marcus asked. "I think she's either delusional or she's planning something. Either way, don't engage with her. If she comes back on your property, document it. Don't talk to her, don't let her engage you in conversation, don't explain yourself. I'm going to look into your deed and property records, and I'll send you a formal letter for your file. But I want you to be careful with this one, Marcus." She seemed unstable. "Yeah, well, unstable people often have the most conviction about their positions. They don't have the self-doubt that makes reasonable people back down." After they hung up, Marcus looked out at his pool. The water was still perfect, still untouched. He realized with a sinking feeling that he'd lost something already, the ability to enjoy it without thinking about her. His phone buzzed, an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him. "Marcus, this is Karen Whitney." Her voice was different now, softer, more vulnerable. "I've been thinking about what happened this morning, and I'm so sorry. I think we both overreacted. I was just being friendly, and I think you're carrying a lot of anger. Would you be willing to meet for coffee? I think we could really connect if we just had a chance to talk about this properly." He ended the call without responding. 3 minutes later, she texted, "You didn't have to be rude about it. You probably won't be happy unless everyone around you is as miserable as you are." He set the phone down and tried to work. It was impossible. Karen Whitney had somehow infected his morning, his day, his peace, with her presence, even though she was gone. At 2 in the afternoon, his doorbell rang. Marcus didn't open it. He went to the security camera app on his phone and saw Karen standing there, this time dressed in expensive athleisure wear, her hair in a perfect ponytail. She had something in her hand, flowers maybe. She rang again and again. Then she did something that made his blood go cold. She walked to the side of his house, down the pathway to his pool area, and she opened the gate, not using the broken latch, but by crawling over it with the kind of determined grace of someone who'd done it before. Marcus was in the backyard in 20 seconds, his phone already recording. Karen was standing by the pool, looking at the water with such longing that, for a moment, Marcus's anger flickered with something like pity. "Karen, you need to leave, now." She turned to face him, and her entire demeanor shifted. The vulnerability vanished. Her face hardened into something resolute and cold. "I'm not leaving," she said. "And if you try to make me, I'm calling the police. I have every right to be here." "You have no right." "I'm calling the police," she repeated, pulling out her phone with theatrical precision. I'm calling them right now and telling them that a man is threatening me on my own property that I'm attempting to establish usage rights to. And I'm going to make sure my voice cracks when I tell them how scared I am." The certainty in her voice was chilling. Marcus realized in that moment that she wasn't bluffing. She had already decided that this was how the story would go. In her mind, she was already the victim. "You're insane," he said. "I'm calling the police." She was already dialing. He could hear it, the 3 numbers being pressed. He stood there, phone still recording, and watched her have a conversation with a dispatcher where she became a woman alone, frightened, trying to peacefully access shared community property while a man verbally assaulted her. Every word was a lie, but she said them with the absolute conviction of someone who believed them. The police arrived 17 minutes later. 2 officers, 1 male and 1 female. They were professional and neutral, but Marcus could see the calculation happening in their faces as they looked at Karen, small, frightened-looking, playing the victim with expert precision, and then at Marcus, larger male, clearly agitated. "Can you just tell me what the property lines are?" the female officer asked, looking at Marcus with an expression of tired patience. She'd done this before, she would do it again. Marcus showed them the deed. He showed them the fence line. He showed them the recording of Karen breaking in. "That just shows her using the gate," the male officer said, watching the video. "It doesn't show her threatening behavior. She's trespassing. She says she believed it was a shared community resource." "It's not." Karen, standing nearby in her perfect athletic wear, looked like she might cry any second. Her voice was small and shaky when she spoke. "I've been so anxious since the construction started. I just wanted to get my anxiety medication regulated through exercise. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone shared everything, and I thought this was the same kind of place. He's been so angry since I first asked. He seemed dangerous." The officers exchanged a look. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay away from the gate," the male officer said to Marcus. "And ma'am, I'm going to need you to respect Mr. Chen's property line. However, I would strongly suggest you two try to resolve this neighborly." It took every ounce of control Marcus possessed not to scream. Karen left and the officers followed her, leaving Marcus standing in his own backyard with the realization that Karen Whitney had just weaponized the police against him. More than that, she'd done it successfully. From their perspective, he was the problem, the angry man, the one being unreasonable. That night, Marcus sat by his pool and didn't go in. Instead, he drank whiskey and made sure every gate was locked, every fence reinforced, every camera was working. He also called Margaret and told her to send that cease and desist letter. What Karen Whitney lacked in actual power, she more than made up for with determination and an absolutely void where her conscience should have been. Marcus discovered this over the next 2 weeks as his carefully constructed life began to systematically fall apart. It started with his HOA. The Westridge Estates Homeowners Association was not particularly active. Most of the residents in the development were busy professionals who paid their fees and ignored the community altogether. Marcus had never been to a meeting. He'd simply existed peacefully in his little corner of the development, grateful for the covenant restrictions that prevented people from putting up vinyl siding or hosting constant parties. But Karen Wheeler had apparently never met a situation she couldn't turn into a personal crusade. An emergency HOA meeting was called for a Tuesday evening. The notice was vague, community safety and shared resources concerns. But Marcus had a very good idea what it was about. He considered not showing up, but his lawyer had advised him to appear, to be reasonable, to document everything. The meeting was held in the Westridge Clubhouse, a bland beige building that smelled like coffee and the overwhelming desperation of people pretending to have important things to discuss. There were maybe 30 people in attendance, which was unusual. Most HOA meetings had 6. Karen was already there, looking appropriately grave and sympathetic, already half surrounded by sympathetic neighbors who were hearing her side of the story. Marcus recognized 3 of them from casual waves and driveway conversations over the 2 years he'd lived there. The HOA president was a man named David Summers, who sold insurance during the day and apparently presided over the neighborhood's governing body with the kind of tepid enthusiasm one brings to tasks they've been guilt-tripped into accepting. He looked profoundly uncomfortable as he gavelled the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," David said. I think we're here because one of our residents has raised some community concerns that I think we need to address as a neighborhood. Karen, would you like to share? Karen stood up slowly, like a woman who was about to testify at trial. She had printed materials, actual bound packets, which she distributed to the assembled neighbors. Marcus felt his stomach drop. She'd prepared for this. She'd probably been planning it since the moment he'd humiliated her by the pool. I want to start by saying that I don't want any conflict, Karen began, her voice carrying that perfect note of reluctance that suggested she desperately tried to avoid this moment. I've tried talking to Marcus directly and he's been unwelcoming. We haven't tried to talk, Marcus said from his seat. You trespassed on my property. Marcus, please let her finish, David said with the kind of weak authority that had never worked on anyone. Thank you, Karen said, touching her hand to her heart as if Marcus's interruption had caused her physical pain. I don't want to get into the details of the incident because I know there are two sides to every story. What I want to focus on is something deeper, something that affects all of us. She clicked on a remote and a presentation started on the wall-mounted screen. It was a slide about shared community values, neighborhood cohesion, and the erosion of community in modern America. It was impressively produced. It looked like it had cost money. When I moved here 3 years ago, Karen continued, I was so excited about Westridge Estates. It promised to be a community of like-minded individuals who valued connection, shared resources, and common good. But increasingly, I've been realizing that not everyone shares those values. I've been reaching out to my neighbors, talking to them about their concerns. And do you know what I've found? Silence, predatory silence. I've found that many of you feel isolated, that you don't know your neighbors, that this development has become just a collection of individual fiefdoms rather than a true community. The slide changed to show statistics about neighborhood isolation and mental health. It was actually compelling if you didn't know it was being used to justify trespassing. My proposal, Karen said, is that the HOA develop a communal amenities policy, that we open up certain properties, those with pools, tennis courts, that sort of thing, to scheduled community use. Think about it. We could have yoga Tuesdays by the pool, Friday pool parties. We could build actual connection. Marcus stood up. That's a lovely idea, he said, but it's based on a false premise. Westridge Estates is not and has never been a communal development. Every property is individually owned. Every property has private amenities. That's the point. Some of us bought here because we wanted privacy, not because we were desperate for forced interaction with our neighbors. Karen smiled at him like he'd just proved her point. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, she said softly. That defensiveness, that assumption that community equals violation, that's the mindset that's destroying our neighborhoods. David Summers looked like he wanted to evaporate. He turned to the assembled neighbors with the air of a man trying to figure out which position would cause the least amount of continued conversation. I think what Karen is suggesting is a good starting point for discussion, he said carefully. Maybe we could form a subcommittee to... I don't think we need a subcommittee, Marcus said. I think we need to respect private property lines, and I think we need to be clear about something. Karen Whitney broke into my house and used my private pool without permission. When I asked her to leave, she lied to the police. Now she's reframing that as a community vision thing, but what it actually is theft of services and trespassing. That's not what happened, Karen said, and her voice had this injured quality that was far more effective than anger would have been. I have severe anxiety, and I was trying to establish a connection to a shared resource so that I could manage my mental health. Marcus made me feel like I was a criminal for wanting to take care of myself. One of the women near Karen, a blonde woman in her 40s named Sandra who lived 4 doors down, reached out and squeezed Karen's shoulder. Marcus realized with sick certainty that Karen had already gotten to her, that Karen had probably spent the last 2 weeks having coffee with the neighbors, building her narrative, earning sympathy. I think everyone should have to prove their property boundaries, Karen said. I think we should require certificates of title to be filed with the HOA. I think we should establish clear guidelines about what constitutes private versus community property. It was brilliant, actually. It was designed to make reasonable people feel unreasonable for objecting, who could be against transparency, who could be against clear guidelines. Marcus absolutely could. What you're describing is a power grab, he said coldly. You're using anxiety and community rhetoric to justify overriding private property rights, and it's not going to work. The room went quiet. Corinne's expression shifted, just for a moment, into something hard and vindictive. Then she smoothed it back into hurt confusion. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said. David Summers gavelled the meeting closed and suggested they reconvene in 2 weeks to continue the discussion. Marcus left immediately, not bothering to socialize, very aware of the eyes tracking his exit. In the parking lot, he called Margaret. "She's trying to change the HOA rules?" Margaret sounded exhausted. "Okay, that's actually smart in an insane way. It's not directly actionable, so I can't sue her for it, but it is harassment. Document everything. Also, I'm going to need you to be more careful about your tone. You sounded angry in there." "I was angry." "I know, but juries and neighbors don't like angry men. They like reasonable men who are being victimized by unreasonable women. You need to flip that narrative." "I shouldn't have to perform reasonableness while being victimized." "I know," Margaret said, and her voice was genuinely kind. "But you do." Over the next week, Marcus noticed subtle shifts in the neighborhood dynamic. People who'd previously waved now looked away. The Kowalskis, who shared the fence with his property, suddenly began aggressive landscaping right along the boundary line, entirely within their rights but clearly a statement. The mail carrier, who'd always been friendly, now seemed distant. Corinne had done something far more effective than any complaint. She'd made Marcus the villain in a story where she was the victim. On Friday evening, his landscaper called. "Hey man, I'm gonna have to bow out," Deshawn said without preamble. "I can't take on the maintenance contract. Something came up." "Deshawn, we have a contract through next spring." "Yeah, I know, and I'm sorry, man, but I'm not trying to get involved in neighborhood beef. Corinne Whitney came by my shop and talked to my wife about how you've been spreading rumors about her mental health. Now my wife is upset with me for working for you." "That's not Corinne is lying." "I know, I believe you, but I don't need this stress, you know. I got enough to deal with." Marcus had to pay a penalty to break the landscaping contract. That was the only immediate financial impact, but it was the psychological impact that mattered more. Corinne had managed to poison the well. She'd reframed his reasonable boundary setting as cruelty toward someone with mental health struggles. It was diabolical. By the following Tuesday, he had an email from his daughter's school. Could he come in for a meeting? One of the other parents had expressed concerns about his behavior toward a neighbor. The school had a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, and they wanted to make sure the school environment was safe for all families. His daughter was in 2nd grade. She didn't even know about the pool incident. "Did Lily say something happened?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "No, Lily seems fine," Mrs. Harrison, the principal, assured him. "But parent behavior affects school culture, and one parent did reach out and express concern that you'd been hostile and threatening. We just want to make sure we're addressing it." "Corinne Whitney called the school about my dispute with her. I'm not at liberty to say who made the report." But they both knew. Marcus left the school building with his hands shaking. He called Margaret from his car. "She's involving the school?" Margaret's voice had shifted into something sharper. "Okay, that's escalation. That's also potentially defamatory if she's making false claims to the school about you. Has she said you're abusive or dangerous?" "Not directly, but she's implied it through her tone and by going to the school at all." "Okay, write down everything, every interaction, every time you've seen her on your property, every text, every email, everything. I'm going to file a formal cease and desist letter, but I want to be ready if this goes further." "How does it go further than involving my child's school?" By week 3, Marcus had started to understand that he was in a battle with someone who had neither the constraints of shame nor the burden of logic. Corinne Whitney operated from a place of absolute certainty that she was the hero of her own story, and nothing, no facts, no evidence, no social norm, could convince her otherwise. She'd also apparently decided that subtlety was overrated. The Facebook post appeared on Friday evening in the Westridge Estates community group. It had a photograph of Marcus's pool, taken from outside his fence line, but clearly visible with the caption, "Some neighbors don't believe in community. They hoard private amenities while others struggle with mental health during construction season. If you believe in the right to community wellness resources, please react with thumbs up. #community not hoarding mental health matters Westridge unity." It had 43 reactions and 17 comments by the time Marcus saw it. Most of the comments were supportive of community wellness. A few were vague judgments of some people who were selfish. Only 3 people had called her out for the vagueness and implications. Marcus typed out a response, then he deleted it, then he called Margaret. "Do not engage," Margaret said before he could even explain. "Do not comment on that post. Screenshot it for documentation, but do not respond. Karen is trying to provoke you into saying something she can screenshot and share out of context. So she just gets to do this. She's doing it anyway. The question is whether you help her by responding. You don't." That night, Marcus got 3 more messages from neighbors he'd thought were friendly. They'd seen the post. They wanted to make sure he knew that they weren't taking sides, but that they understood Karen's concerns about mental health. It was the exact kind of non-committal fence-sitting that accomplished everything they were pretending not to do, make Marcus feel isolated and implicitly agree with Karen's framing. Saturday morning, he noticed someone had left a note in his mailbox. It was in childish handwriting on lined paper. "You're mean too, Mrs. Karen. She is nice. You are a bad man." It was unsigned, but Marcus had no doubt who'd put their 8-year-old up to writing it. He called Margaret again. "That's potentially illegal," Margaret said. "But it's also a child, so proving intentional harassment gets complicated. Document it anyway. Keep it sealed in an envelope." "What do I do?" "You stop letting her live in your head," Margaret said. "I know that's easier said than done, but Marcus, you are not responsible for Karen's perception of you. You're not responsible for the neighborhood's gullibility. You're only responsible for your own actions, which have been legal and reasonable. Everything else is just noise." But it didn't feel like noise. It felt like a slow-motion car accident where he was watching his reputation get systematically dismantled, and no one would listen to him when he explained what was actually happening. Monday morning, he had an email from a lawyer he'd never heard of. The email was formal and threatening, claiming that Karen Whitney was considering filing suit against him for emotional distress and defamation based on his false and damaging characterization of her mental state to community members. The lawyer's name was Richard Kowalski. Richard Kowalski, Marcus realized with a start, was married to the woman whose husband had been doing aggressive landscaping along Marcus's fence line. The Kowalskis weren't just supporting Karen. They'd apparently hired themselves out as her legal team. He forwarded the email to Margaret with a note. "This feels like it's getting worse." Margaret called him back immediately. "Okay, this is actually good news," she said, and Marcus couldn't figure out why. "This means she's getting desperate. People who have good cases don't need to threaten lawsuit. They just file. She's throwing this at you to see what sticks. Did you defame her?" "No, I told the truth." "Good. Then we're in a position of strength, not weakness. I'm going to draft a response letter that is very firm about cease and desist, about documenting her harassment campaign, and about the fact that Richard Kowalski might want to disqualify himself from representing her given that he's a neighbor with his own property dispute with you. I'm also going to make sure that letter is very clear that any further harassment will be met with our own legal action." "Will it stop her?" "Honestly, probably not. But it will create a legal record that shows you're the reasonable one responding to her harassment, not the other way around." Margaret was right. The cease and desist letter didn't stop Karen. What it did was make her more careful. The Facebook posts became less direct. The comments about neighbors who don't understand community values were vague enough that she could claim she wasn't talking about Marcus specifically. The meetings with neighbors happened in their private homes instead of public spaces, but it continued. By week 4, Marcus noticed that his business partner at work had started making comments about workplace professionalism and making sure we're not getting involved in neighborhood disputes that could reflect on the company. By week 5, he'd been subtly removed from the client-facing portion of the Shanghai project, the same project that had closed to huge success. By week 6, he started to wonder if Karen had contacted his company directly. "Did anyone from the neighborhood reach out to you?" he asked his partner, James, during a routine status call. James hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. "Why would you ask that?" James said carefully. "Because my responsibilities at work have shifted. My involvement in the Shanghai project has been reduced, and I'm wondering if Karen Whitney has weaponized social media against my professional life like she's already done with everything else." James took a long breath. Someone did reach out to me on LinkedIn. They said it was important to understand that you had disputes with neighbors that might indicate behavioral issues. I didn't believe them, Marcus. But I also have a company to protect, and I have investors who don't like controversy. Marcus felt something inside him go cold and still. So you're removing me from client work to protect the company from a woman who's lying about me. I'm being cautious. I'm trying to protect you and the company. If I take a more skeptical stance toward these claims and then something comes out that shows they're true, I look bad. If I take them seriously and they're false, at least I've demonstrated that I take customer relationships seriously. You're still punishing me for being a victim of harassment. No, I'm protecting my company, and I'm sorry, but that has to come first. Marcus ended the call and sat in his home office looking at the backyard. The pool was still perfect, still unused, still a symbol of everything Karen had taken from him, not the pool itself, but the peace that came with it. He called Margaret. "Can I sue for defamation?" he asked without preamble. "Technically, maybe, but it would be expensive, it would take years, and you'd have to prove damages. The best you'd get is a judgment she couldn't pay. So she gets to destroy my reputation and nothing happens." "No," Margaret said. "Something does happen. You create a legal record of everything. You respond with dignity and professionalism to every accusation. You let her be the unhinged one, and you be the reasonable person responding with documentation." "I'm tired of being reasonable, Margaret. I'm tired of being the bigger person while she's out there rewriting reality." "I know," Margaret said, and she genuinely sounded sympathetic. "But being angry about it, even if it's justified, is going to give her more ammunition. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to draft the most devastating cease and desist letter you've ever seen. It's going to detail every single incident, every single harassment campaign, every single way she's tried to defame you and interfere with your professional life. I'm going to make it clear that we have documentation of all of it. And I'm going to make it clear that any further contact, any further posts, any further outreach to your neighbors, your company, your daughter's school will be met with aggressive legal action." Will it work? Maybe not, but it will make her stop and think. And it will create a document that, if the cease and desist letter was delivered to Karen's house on a Thursday by a process server. Marcus's lawyer had sent it certified, registered, the whole thing, creating a legal record of delivery that Karen couldn't dispute. For exactly 4 days, everything was quiet. Marcus actually allowed himself to hope that it was over, that Margaret had been right, that the weight of legal language had actually made Karen understand that he was serious, that she couldn't just wage psychological warfare forever without consequence. On the 5th day, the local news showed up at his house. He was in his office when he saw the van pull up. A logo on the side read, "Channel 7 News, your local stories matter." By the time he realized what was happening, the reporter, a woman named Jessica Chen, no relation, was ringing his doorbell. "Mr. Chen, I'm Jessica Chen with Channel 7. I'd like to talk to you about the pool dispute you're having with your neighbor. We've gotten some information about the situation and we're running a story tonight." Marcus did what Margaret had told him to do if this ever happened. He said, "I have nothing to comment," and closed the door. But his heart was pounding so hard he thought he might be having a heart attack. He called Margaret. "A news station." "What did they ask?" Margaret's voice was sharp. "They just asked if I would comment on a pool dispute." "Don't talk to them. Don't engage. Do you know what they're about to do? They're about to run a story where a woman with anxiety issues is denied access to water during construction season by a wealthy man with a private pool. Guess who looks like the villain in that narrative?" "But that's not what happened." "I know, but facts don't matter to local news. They matter to courts. If this ever goes to legal proceedings, all this media stuff goes away. But for now, you just have to survive the PR disaster, and the best way to do that is to not engage with it." By 6 o'clock, Marcus was watching Channel 7 News. The segment was called "Community Denied," when neighbors put profit over people. It was even worse than he'd imagined. They interviewed 3 of Karen's supporters: Sandra from down the street, a woman named Michelle who apparently worked at the community center, and a therapist who'd never met Marcus but explained, in clinical terms, how gatekeeping of wellness resources could exacerbate anxiety. Then they interviewed Karen. She was perfect. She sat in her living room, dressed in soft neutrals, her hair gently curled, and told a story of a woman with severe anxiety who'd simply tried to use exercise as a coping mechanism, only to be verbally assaulted by a neighbor who valued his private amenities more than his neighbor's mental health. "I'm not angry at him," Karen said, and her voice had this hurt, forgiving quality that made her seem like she was being incredibly generous to a man who didn't deserve it. "I think he's probably going through something difficult. I just wish he could see that community is more important than hoarding." The reporter asked if she had a comment from Marcus's side. She said she'd tried to reach him multiple times, but he'd refused to engage. The reporter then said, "We tried to get Mr. Chen to comment, but he declined to discuss the matter." It was a hatchet job, but it was also technically accurate. Marcus had declined to comment. He hadn't told them why. He hadn't explained that his lawyer had advised against it. All they captured was silence, and silence always looks like guilt when someone else is speaking eloquently about their victimization. By 8 o'clock that night, Marcus had 43 new texts and emails. Some were supportive. Most were not. 3 people in his neighborhood had written to the news station expressing solidarity with Karen's narrative. One person had started a Change.org petition about community access rights in private developments. It had 700 signatures. Marcus put his phone down and walked to his pool. The night was warm. The water was still perfect, still untouched. He sat on the edge and thought about taking a sledgehammer to it, about destroying the thing that had started all of this. Then he thought about what that would look like to his neighbors, how Karen would spin it, how she'd use his destruction of his own property as evidence of his unstable mental state. So he just sat there, staring at water he couldn't even enjoy. Friday morning, his company sent him a formal letter. His services were no longer required. They were offering him 2 weeks of severance in exchange for a signed NDA that would prevent him from discussing the circumstances of his termination. He called Margaret, but he already knew what she'd say. "That's illegal, but it's also a large company with an HR department and lawyers, and you're one person. If you want to fight this, we fight it, but I'm being honest with you. It's going to be a long, expensive battle, and they have more resources than you do. They're counting on you being demoralized and exhausted. So I just let them do it. Or you find a new job and move on. I know that feels like letting them win, but sometimes the win is surviving and moving forward, not winning in court." Marcus had spent 4 years of his life in a divorce settlement fighting for what was fair. He was not in the mood to do it again. He took the severance, signed the NDA, and updated his LinkedIn that he was exploring new opportunities in the private sector. He also called his ex-wife, something he'd sworn he'd never do again. "I need to talk to you about Lily," he said when she answered, "and about the school." "What happened?" He told her. He told her all of it, starting with Karen in the pool and ending with the news story and his job. He expected his ex-wife to take Karen's side. Instead, she did something shocking. She believed him. "That's insane," Rebecca said. "You have a right to your privacy, especially in your own home. Can you sue her?" "My lawyer says it would be expensive and time-consuming, and probably not worth it." "Well, then you need to change the narrative. You need to make her look crazy." "How?" "I don't know, but you let her control this story, Marcus, and you're going to lose. You need to take control back." After they hung up, Marcus sat with that thought. Margaret wanted him to be patient, to document, to wait for the legal system to work. His ex-wife was telling him to be proactive, to fight back. But how do you fight back against someone who's willing to lie, to manipulate, to use social media and news stations and schools and lawyers to try to destroy you? How do you combat that without becoming the angry, aggressive man that Karen was already claiming he was? That's when he made a decision that his lawyer would have advised against. He called the news station. Jessica Chen actually picked up the phone, which surprised him. "Mr. Chen, I was hoping you'd call." Marcus didn't tell Margaret what he was doing. He knew better. But he also knew that Margaret was focused on legal strategy, and legal strategy had gotten him fired from his job, isolated from his neighbors, and publicly humiliated. It was time for a different approach. He spent the weekend preparing. He gathered every document, every text message, every security camera footage, every email. He created a timeline with dates and times and specific incidents. He even hired a private investigator to look into Karen's background, something his lawyer had said was a waste of money, but that Marcus needed to do anyway. What the investigator found was interesting. Karen had lived in 4 different neighborhoods in the past 8 years. In 2 of them, she'd been involved in documented disputes with neighbors. In one case, she'd actually been told by law enforcement to stay off the neighbor's property. In another, she'd filed reports with the city that were later found to be baseless. She had a pattern, a very clear pattern of behavior. Monday morning, Marcus went to the Channel 7 studios. Jessica Chen met him in a small office, and she had that look that journalists get when they smell a different narrative than the one they'd already filed. "Tell me everything," she said, turning on her recorder. Marcus did. He told her about Karen breaking into his pool. He told her about the lies to the police. He told her about the HOA presentation, the Facebook campaign, the calls to his business, the calls to his daughter's school. He told her about his job, the news story, everything. And then he gave her the timeline, the documents, the investigator's report, and the security camera footage. Jessica watched it in silence. When she was done, she sat back. "This is pretty compelling," she said. "I'm going to need to verify some of this, but if it checks out, this is actually a better story than the one we ran." "Better how?" "Because it shows a pattern of harassment. It shows someone weaponizing sympathy and social media and even official channels to attack a neighbor. It's not a cute story about someone with anxiety not being allowed to use a pool. It's a story about someone using mental health claims as a shield against accountability for bad behavior." "Will you run it?" Marcus asked. "If it checks out, yeah, I'll run it. And I gotta say, I feel pretty stupid for running the first story without doing more due diligence. This is good journalism. This matters." By Wednesday, Channel 7 had fact-checked everything Marcus had given them. They'd contacted the police department and confirmed the original complaint. They'd looked at the HOA records and confirmed that Karen had indeed requested a meeting. They'd called his previous employer at the business and gotten a reluctant confirmation that, yes, Karen had reached out about his behavior issues. Most importantly, they'd contacted the private investigator's sources and confirmed Karen's history of similar disputes in previous neighborhoods. The story that aired Wednesday night was titled, "When Sympathy is a Weapon: The Truth Behind the Pool Dispute." It was devastating. Jessica Chen opened with the original story she'd run, acknowledging that she'd been incomplete in her initial reporting. She then methodically dismantled Karen's narrative, showing the security footage of Karen breaking in, then contrasting it with Karen's claims to police that she'd assumed it was a shared resource. "The question isn't whether Karen Whitney had anxiety," Jessica said directly to camera. "The question is whether that anxiety justifies lying to police, harassing a neighbor, and enlisting the community to support her version of events. Our investigation shows a pattern of similar behavior in Ms. Whitney's previous neighborhoods. We also found that Mr. Chen's account of events is corroborated by documentation, security footage, and police records." Then they interviewed Marcus, not aggressively but thoughtfully. They let him explain his side without interruption. They showed the documents he'd gathered. They showed the timeline. By the end of the segment, Marcus had been transformed from the villain into the victim. And Karen Whitney was shown for what she actually was: someone who weaponized sympathy and social media to attack people who wouldn't let her have her way. His phone started blowing up before the broadcast even ended. Most of the messages were apologies. People who'd believed the first story, who'd let Karen's narrative shape their opinions, suddenly realizing they'd been conned. Sandra came by his house to apologize in person, looking genuinely embarrassed. The school principal called to say they'd been wrong to be concerned. His ex-wife called to say, "See, I told you fighting back works." But the message that mattered most came at 10:47 p.m. that night. It was from the HOA. "We're looking into dissolving the cease and desist motion that would have changed property regulations based on the community input that was provided under false pretenses. We'd like to meet with you about this." The HOA meeting was held on the following Tuesday. This time, the attendance was even higher. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Karen didn't show up. Her lawyer, Richard Kowalski, tried to attend, but David Summers informed him that since this was an HOA matter about community governance, only residents could participate. Richard left, and Marcus felt a small twinge of satisfaction at watching him go. David opened the meeting by acknowledging that the previous motion to change property regulations had been based on incomplete information. He read, with obvious discomfort, a formal statement that the HOA was withdrawing the proposed amendment and apologizing to the community for allowing the process to be used inappropriately. "We've learned an important lesson here," David said, and Marcus could see the whole experience had aged him. "Which is that we need to be more careful about the premises on which we make decisions. We also have an HR professional here from another community who's graciously agreed to give us some guidance about recognizing manipulative behavior in governance processes." The professional, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morris, stood and spoke for about 20 minutes about how communities can be vulnerable to what she called social hijacking, where individuals manipulate official processes to achieve personal goals. "It's important to note," Dr. Morris said, "that this isn't just about this specific dispute. It's about recognizing that anyone, regardless of their intentions or sympathetic circumstances, should not be able to use community governance to override property rights. The moment we allow that, we've created a system where the most manipulative people, not the most ethical, not the most reasonable, but the most willing to weaponize social pressure, have power over everyone else." When the meeting was over, several neighbors approached Marcus to apologize. Some seemed genuine. Others seemed performative, trying to be on the right side now that the narrative had shifted. Marcus accepted them all with grace because his lawyer had told him that grace was the appropriate response. He also made a point of going up to Sandra. "I'm not angry," Marcus said, "but I also want you to understand what happened here. You believed one person's emotional appeal over facts and your neighbor's actual character. You let friendship and sympathy convince you that someone was lying about being victimized. The lesson isn't about Karen, it's about yourself. Be more careful about who you believe." Sandra's face colored and she nodded. Marcus went home to his pool. He sat in the lounge chair with a cold drink as the sun started to set, turning the water orange and gold. For the first time in 6 weeks, he actually felt the way he'd felt before Karen Whitney had broken through his gate. Like the world was a place where normal, reasonable people could exist and not be destroyed by the malice of the unreasonable. The legal aftermath took another few months to resolve. Margaret filed suit for defamation, harassment, and interference with employment. Karen's lawyer tried to claim she had immunity based on her mental health status, but that particular argument didn't gain any traction with a judge who'd read the investigator's report. In the end, Karen agreed to a settlement that included a public apology, cease and desist from any further contact or statements about Marcus, and substantial monetary damages. She was also required to remove all posts from social media related to the dispute. She lasted 3 weeks before she moved out of the neighborhood entirely. Marcus learned later that she'd bought a house in another development, one known for being less tight-knit, more of a transient community where people didn't know each other and certainly wouldn't organize around one person's narrative. He realized that Karen probably hadn't actually learned anything. She'd just been temporarily inconvenienced by consequences and was now moving on to her next neighborhood, where she'd likely try the same tactics on someone else who didn't have the resources or willingness to fight back the way Marcus had. But that wasn't his problem anymore. What mattered was that his life began to return to normal. His consulting business started picking up, better than before, actually, because the news story had made him locally famous as the guy who stood up to Karen. He found a new business partner, someone who believed in him, and they started their own firm. His daughter's school stopped being weird with him. His neighbors, while not exactly warm, at least returned to the baseline of casual neighborhood distance that he actually preferred. And every morning Marcus sat by his pool with his coffee and just existed. He used it. He swam in it. He had the occasional small dinner party by it. Not because Karen had made him feel obligated to justify his property usage to anyone, but because it was his to use in whatever way he chose. One day, about 8 months after the final settlement, Marcus was having lunch with his lawyer, Margaret. They'd become something like friends over the course of all this. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never fought back?" Margaret asked. "If you just accepted the job loss and the reputation damage and tried to disappear?" "Every day," Marcus said honestly. "And the answer is I'd be devastated. My business would be gone, my reputation would be ruined, I'd probably have to move. Karen would have one. But But I also wonder if I had to become someone I didn't want to be in order to survive her. I had to be aggressive. I had to hire lawyers and private investigators and media consultants. I had to be willing to look her in the eye and fight back when my natural instinct was to just back down and let her think what she wanted to think. That's the thing about dealing with unreasonable people, Margaret said. You can't use the strategies that work on reasonable people. You can't appeal to fairness or logic or shared norms because they don't believe in those things. You have to match them strategically without matching them morally. You have to be aggressive and thorough without being dishonest. Marcus nodded. He understood. What he'd learned through this experience was that there are people in the world who are willing to lie, to manipulate, to destroy other people's lives for the sake of getting their way. And the only way to deal with them isn't to be better than them. It's to refuse to be defeated by them.